This is Ian Carey reporting for SEScoops.com. And last night, a new era in professional wrestling began. The Wednesday Night Wars kicked off as All Elite Wrestling presented their first episode of Dynamite on TNT. And AEW presented their first 2-hour live show on the USA Network. We're going to run down both shows in this video, and then after we'll take a look at some of the key takeaways in last night's first battle of the Wednesday Night War. So let's kick things off with AEW Dynamite. And older fans, not old fans, but older fans, might remember, or very likely remember, that it was Jushin Liger versus Brian Pillman in the first match in WCW Nitro history. Well, 23 years from now, many AEW fans might remember that it was Cody versus Sammy Guevara in the first ever match of AEW Dynamite history. And it was fitting that Cody was the first person AEW fans saw walk to the ring. The first wrestler to come to the ring in AEW Dynamite history was Cody, which is fitting because had Cody not left WWE in 2016, we might not have AEW, and we certainly wouldn't have AEW in the form that it currently exists. As for Sammy Guevara, he wrestled this match like everything was on the line for him. He resorted to some underhanded tactics as he was on the outside of the ring area. Cody goes for a tope, but Guevara pulls Brandy in front of him, so Cody hits his own wife. But that would only provide justification for Brandy to get involved in the match later. She would hit Sammy from the outside, setting up a disaster kick from Cody, but that only set up a near fall as Guevara kicked out at 2. The finish of the match would come, however, when Guevara went for a shooting star press off the top rope. Cody countered it, put him into a roll-up, and got the 3 count. And with the win, Cody maintains or retains his title shot at Full Gear on November 9th. In the build-up to this match, Cody had said in interviews that because wins and losses matter so much in AEW, that should he lose a match between now and Full Gear, it's not guaranteed that he would still receive his title shot against Chris Jericho at Full Gear. Now, more action took place after this match was over. It looked as though we were going to get an in-ring interview with Tony Schiavone. And then Sammy Guevara came up, and it looked as though he had something further to say to Cody about the match. But then he stuck out his hand as if to, make amends with Cody. However, this could have all been in an effort to distract Cody from Chris Jericho, who hit the ring area and then attacked Cody. Jericho would powerbomb Cody on top of 2 chairs set up on the outside in an effort to soften up his opponent at Full Gear. Next up, we had Maxwell Jacob Friedman taking on Brandon Cutler. And MJF in the build-up to this match had made fun of Brandon Cutler for being a fan of such games as Dungeons and Dragons, but Brandon Cutler was not able to pick up any measure of revenge against MJF in this match. He did attempt at one point to come off the top rope, but it appeared he had tweaked his knee, and that left an opening for MJF to secure an armbar, which he has named the Salt of the Earth armbar, and he got the submission win there. So MJF, that was his first singles match in AEW, and he picked up the victory there. Chris Van Vliet was then showed at ringside and he said all the stars were out for the premiere episode of AEW Dynamite on TNT, including the stars of Jay and Silent Bob, Kevin Smith, and Jason Mewes. They have a new movie coming out. Chris Jericho has a role in the film. But as they were talking, Jack Evans and Angelico came out. And the duo of Kevin Smith and Jason Mewes and Angelico and Jack Evans were in a verbal spat when Private Party came to the ringside and came to Mewes and Smith's aid. So, wonder if that means we will see a match between Private Party and Angelico and Jack Evans in the near future. We might, but before then, Private Party, they will want to turn their attention to the Young Bucks, who they face next week in the tag team title tournament. Next up, we had an interview segment with Tony Schiavone interviewing the members of SCU. Now, in this interview, the members of SoCal Uncensored would determine which two members of their three-man unit will represent the team in the AEW World Tag Team Championship tournament, as only two members of SCU can represent the team throughout the tournament. So SCU announced that it would be Christopher Daniels and Frankie Kazarian, the two members of the team who have the longest history with one another, going back years and years and years, through Ring of Honor, TNA, multiple promotions. It will be Kazarian and Daniels representing SCU in the AEW Tag Team Title Tournament. However, this segment was interrupted by Phoenix and Pentagon, the Lucha Bros, and they communicated to SCU that the Lucha Bros are the best tag team in the universe, and this segment eventually came to blows, with the two teams having to be pulled apart to end the segment. Interestingly enough, SCU faces the best friends in the next round of the AEW Tag Team Title Tournament, and the winner of that match will face the Dark Order in the semifinals on October 23rd. The Lucha Bros take on the team of Jungle Boy and Luchasaurus in the first round, and they'll face the winners of the Young Bucks versus Private Party in the second round. So if the Lucha Bros and SCU are to meet in this tournament, they won't meet until the finals, unless the brackets are changed. But anyway, those two teams came to blows here last night on the first ever episode of AEW Dynamite. Next up, we had Hangman Adam Page versus the Bastard Pac. And this was sort of an interesting match with a lot on the line, especially as it concerns win-loss records in AEW. Page is coming off having dropped the inaugural AEW World Championship match against Chris Jericho, whereas Pac is coming off his first match in the promotion, which was a victory over Kenny Omega. So, a win for either wrestler here sort of launches them into that upper echelon where Pac is probably thinking about getting a title shot, and Hangman Page has sort of got himself back into the title picture. So Pac would pick up the victory in this match, but it was not without controversy. Earl Hebner was the referee, and in the match's closing moments, Hebner was out of position and did not see the low blow from the Bastard Pac, who would then go to the top rope and hit a black arrow, that he's now calling that move, and then locked Page into the Brutalizer, which was the same move he used to defeat Kenny Omega at All Out. And Hebner would call for the bell. So for Pac, he now improves to 2 wins and 0 losses. And his 2 wins have been over highly touted competition in Hangman Page and Kenny Omega. So one has to wonder, how long is it now until Pac receives a shot at Chris Jericho's AEW World Championship belt? Speaking of World Championship belts, The next match was for the inaugural AEW Women's World Championship between Riho and the native beast Nyla Rose. Dr. Britt Baker, DMD, would work the commentary booth during this match, though she would note that she would much rather be in the ring challenging for the title herself. This was very much a David and Goliath style match, with Nyla Rose being one of the largest women in the division. Possibly only Awesome Kong is able to rival her in terms of size, and Riho being one of the smaller women in the division. But despite the size advantage, Nyla Rose would pull out all the stops trying to get the win. She would pull out chairs and set up Riho on top of them, but she would miss a diving cannonball to the outside, which would allow her opponent to recover. Riho would eventually become the first ever AEW Women's World Champion when she hit a running double knee strike on Rose as Rose was in a kneeling position. Riho, your very unlikely first ever AEW Women's World Champion. Now, after the match, Michael Nakazawa came to the ring and he said he was going to interview Riho, but Nyla Rose was not done. She attacked Michael Nakazawa. She then turned her attention back to the champion and looked as though she was going to give Riho a Death Valley driver onto the ring apron. But Kenny Omega, who has teamed with Riho in Japan previously and is also the executive in charge of the Joshi and women's divisions, although Brandy Rhodes also plays a role, Kenny Omega came out, pulled Riho down, sort of gestured like, "What are you doing, Nyla?" And that's how the segment ended. So your first ever AEW Women's World Champion is Riho. Nyla Rose, not pleased about it, but that is the result. Then next up, it was the main event, the first ever main event on AEW Dynamite. Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks teaming together to take on the AEW World Champion Chris Jericho and his teammates Santana and Ortiz, formerly known as LAX. But Jon Moxley would make his presence felt during this match as well. He basically showed up and then just pulled Kenny Omega away from the match. He grabbed Omega and they brawled into the backstage area, and there was sort of a VIP area set up along that area as well. Private party at this point, I guess, was gone. Moxley grabs Omega, picks him up into a very high angle DDT and crashes him down head first into a glass table. Meanwhile, back in the ring, the Young Bucks trying to fend off a 3-on-2 attack from Jericho, Santana, and Ortiz. They were unsuccessful, however, as Matt Jackson ran into the Judas effect and Jericho picked up the pinfall victory for his team. Now, Cody attempted to come out and stop the 3-on-2 attack, even up the odds. But then Sammy Guevara came out and sort of shrugged, kicked Cody low, and aligned with Santana, Ortiz, and Jericho. Then Dustin Rhodes hit the ring and looked to save his brother Cody from what was now a 4-on-3 attack. But then Jake Hager would show up, the former Jack Swagger, and he would take out Dustin. And we have a 5-person unit standing tall to end the first AEW Dynamite. Now, if I told you 5 people, 5 wrestlers will stand tall to end the first ever episode of AEW Dynamite, you would likely think that I was referring to Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, Cody, and Hangman Page, but there's another 5-man unit in AEW now, and they are Chris Jericho, Jake Hager, Sammy Guevara, Santana, and Ortiz. And that's how AEW Dynamite would go off the air. Their next event is in Boston next week, where we will find out more about what Chris Jericho's new faction, new group of 5, what they have in store for AEW. We'll find that out next week. So let's move on over to NXT now, the first ever 2-hour edition of NXT on the USA Network. And they kicked things off with an NXT Championship match, Matt Riddle challenging Adam Cole. Now, if you're NXT, you know that the first segment of this show is going up against the first ever segment in the history of AEW Dynamite. So your first segment has to be historic as well. And in the build-up to this match, fans have been given plenty of reason to believe that Matt Riddle could walk away from this match the new NXT champion. Riddle had put Cole in the Fujiwara armbar last week, and then in NXT's injury report, which went out later, it was noted that Cole was believed to have suffered a radius fracture in his forearm. Cole was also removed from NXT live events over the last week. So it looked as though Cole was coming in injured, and he had a cast on his hand, although he was still medically cleared to compete. Despite the injury, however, Adam Cole would retain his title against the original bro Matt Riddle. Riddle would again attempt the Fujiwara armbar as well as the bro mission, but Cole would counter those moves and hit the last shot for the victory. As he's celebrating in the ring, however, Finn Balor's music hits, and the former NXT champion walks to the ring and lets the current NXT champion know that Finn Balor is once again NXT. Can you believe it? Finn Balor is moving to the NXT brand. Now, we've seen limited Finn Balor in the last couple of months. He was defeated by Bray Wyatt at SummerSlam. But his role on the main roster had clearly decreased in recent months. I mean, he did take some time away after getting married. But now here we have Finn Balor, a formerly beloved member of the NXT roster, a member of NXT again. It had been teased in recent weeks that Kevin Owens could possibly be on his way to NXT. Owens himself tweeted out a tease that he could be NXT bound after being fired by Shane McMahon. However, Owens has now launched a wrongful dismissal, yada, yada, yada. And that all happens on Friday nights if you're interested. So no Kevin Owens in NXT, at least not currently, but Finn Balor has arrived and he made his presence known to NXT champion Adam Cole last night. Next up, we had a match between Io Shirai and Mia Yim, and this was an important match for both women. Now, both have challenged Shayna Baszler for the NXT Women's Championship unsuccessfully previously, and both were in a number one contenders match recently, won by Candice LeRae. So both women trying to get back into the title picture here. Only one woman could do so, and the winner of this match was Io Shirai. She picked up the win with her patented moonsault and now moves one step closer to getting another crack at Shayna Baszler's championship. As for Mia Yim, this is 3 disappointing losses in a row for her. She lost to Baszler at TakeOver Toronto, then she was unable to win the number one contenders match won by Candice LeRae, and then she drops another match here to Io Shirai. Next up, we had Velveteen Dream, and he was talking about losing his NXT North American champion to another member of the Undisputed Era, Roderick Strong. Velveteen Dream came out with his notable purple hue in the air and said that he is very focused on getting a rematch with Roderick Strong, and that when he does, he will be the NXT North American champion once again. Then next up, we had Shane Thorne taking on Johnny Gargano. Now, this match to me felt similar to Cody versus Sammy Guevara on AEW Dynamite. You had one guy very established in the company, Cody for AEW, Gargano for NXT, going up against a highly touted prospect for the brand, Sammy Guevara for AEW and Shane Thorne for NXT. And in each case, the prospect would show that they had a lot to offer, but it would be the more established wrestler winning the match. So it would be Shane Thorne showing off a lot of high impact offense, but ultimately it would be Johnny Gargano who would pick up the Duke. He got the win following a super kick. So now Johnny Gargano, former NXT champion, how far away is he from being in the NXT championship picture once again? Well, that picture got a lot more crowded last night. Next up, we had the NXT Women's Championship matches. Shayna Baszler would defend against Candice LeRae, and Baszler would once again successfully defend her title. LeRae got in a lot of offense during the match, and there appeared to be plenty of moments where it looked as though she was going to become the new NXT Women's Champion. However, she missed a moonsault. Shayna Baszler locked in the choke and never let go. LeRae was forced to tap. And now we're left wondering a little bit about what's next in the women's division. Io Shirai picked up a big win over Mia Yim earlier, so we could see Shirai versus Baszler in a heel versus heel NXT Women's Championship match, or possibly some other contender will come out and lay a claim to a title shot. But Shayna Baszler, she is looking more and more like she is going to clear out this division, and she takes out the highly touted Candice LeRae in a match where I feel many felt that LeRae was going to come out the new champion. She would not, however. Next up, we had Pete Dunne going up against Danny Burch. And with Dunne, he has been on a roll since coming to NXT from the NXT UK brand, and he would continue his winning ways this week over Burch. Now, previously, we'd seen Dunne develop a new submission hold that was based out of his finger snapping spot. But this week, he just hit the finger snapping spot as usual on Burch, but then went and hit the bitter end for the victory. However, after the match was over, Dunne did not have long to celebrate. As the lights went out, Damian Priest's music and video are heard and seen, and Priest comes to the ring ambushing Pete Dunne and hitting him with the Reckoning. So now it looks like we are going to see a match sometime in the near future between Damian Priest and the former longtime United Kingdom champion, Pete Dunne. Finally, we would have the main event. It would be the rubber match between the Street Profits and Kyle O'Reilly and Bobby Fish. These two met at NXT TakeOver Toronto, with the Street Profits winning. However, O'Reilly and Bobby Fish would then win the titles back on a subsequent episode of NXT, and they would meet here in the main event tonight. But it would be the numbers game once again for the Undisputed Era, as Roderick Strong came out to the ring. That forced the Street Profits to have to pay attention to him, and the distraction would allow Fish and O'Reilly to hit some double team moves and pick up the victory. Adam Cole NXT champion Adam Cole came out to celebrate as the Undisputed Era continued their golden prophecy this week as Cole retained his title against Matt Riddle. Fish and O'Reilly retained their tag titles against the Street Profits, and Roderick Strong didn't have to defend his title. However, the Undisputed Era's golden celebration would not come to pass as Tommaso Ciampa's music hit. He returned to Full Sail and confronted Adam Cole to close the show. The former champion Tommaso Ciampa has to be in line to get a shot at Goldie, as he proclaims the NXT Championship to be. But earlier in the evening, Finn Balor had already come face to face with Adam Cole as well. So this week on NXT, 2 former NXT champions went face to face with the current NXT champion. What this means for the next NXT championship match that William Regal makes is unclear. But Finn Balor and Tommaso Ciampa are back in NXT, and that's something the Undisputed Era probably isn't too happy about. So now that the first battle in the Wednesday Night War has been fought, we can stand back a little and take a look at how each company did. Obviously, entertainment is subjective, so what you thought of each show is going to be dependent on what type of pro wrestling fan that you are. But one notable aspect of the Wednesday Night Wars, in terms of how they differ from the Monday Night Wars, is that on Wednesday nights, each show seems to be geared towards wrestling fans. Whereas for Raw, SmackDown, and sometimes Nitro, those shows were geared towards the mainstream audience who maybe aren't hardcore wrestling fans. And in the case of WWE, it is very often marketed towards kids and their parents. But that's not what you get on Wednesday nights. Wednesday nights, NXT and AEW is geared towards pro wrestling fans. And NXT, while they haven't said this as much as AEW says this, NXT is a far more sports-centric, or has a more sports-centric approach to pro wrestling than either Raw or SmackDown does. So that's one notable difference between the Wednesday Night Wars and what happened on Monday nights 20 years ago. But let's take a look at 4 different categories that we can evaluate NXT and AEW Dynamite on. So we can take a look at which show felt more important, which show carried more historical significance. We can compare the 2 shows in terms of the match quality, the storyline development, and how much each show made you want to tune in and see what takes place next week. So let's start off with how important each show felt. And in this category, I don't think it can be argued by too many. AEW Dynamite felt more important than NXT on USA did. Now, the NXT show felt very historically significant as well, but there are 2 key factors which made AEW feel more important. The first is the attendance. AEW had over 14,000 in attendance for Dynamite last night, whereas NXT's show in Full Sail University, they only hold a few hundred in there. Now, the setup in NXT, the way the fans are really on top of the action and how excited the fans generally are, helps to make up for that for NXT. And certainly we've been watching NXT and comparing it to Raw or SmackDown in the last few years. And certainly the idea that they are only taping matches in front of a few hundred people does hurt how important that show feels. 14,000 people watching something feels far more important than 400 or 500 people doing so. So AEW's got the edge in that regard. Also, last night's show of Dynamite just felt a little bit more important than NXT on USA because it was the first episode of AEW Dynamite. New combined with big equals important. And that's what AEW Dynamite felt like last night. However, Dynamite is not always going to be filmed in front of 14,000 people. This was the first episode and tickets were a hot commodity. Are they going to be filming just a standard Wednesday night episode in front of 14,000 people this time next year? They might be, but they won't have that new feeling to go on to get those tickets to sell out. So in that regard, AEW defeats NXT in terms of feeling of importance. Now in terms of match quality, this is a very subjective part of pro wrestling. What one person feels is a good match is not necessarily what another person is going to feel is a good match. And different matches have different objectives as well. So sometimes a match, for instance, Brandon Cutler versus Maxwell Jacob Friedman, that match isn't supposed to be a 20-minute barn burner with near falls and finishes. It was meant to highlight Maxwell Jacob Friedman as a guy who can win wrestling matches. However, if you wanted to compare the match quality on AEW Dynamite last night versus on NXT on USA, I would give the slight edge in that to NXT. Now, the reason for this is the match to kick off NXT and the match to end NXT were both takeover quality. Each match felt like you could potentially see new champions crowned, so the near falls felt very significant. In the case of Riddle versus Cole, you had 30 minutes of uninterrupted programming, so you really felt like you were watching a takeover. And I feel that those two matches were... Cody versus Sammy Guevara was very good as well. Pac versus Hangman Page, very good as well. But there was just something about Riddle versus Cole and Street Profits versus Undisputed Era, which to me felt like the most significant matches of the night between either show. And so in this category, again, this is subjective. Perhaps you view it differently, but I've got NXT beating AEW in terms of match quality last night. However, a little asterisk in that match quality is the most subjective of all categories in pro wrestling fandom. The next category that we can begin to compare AEW Dynamite versus NXT is in storyline development. So what happened in terms of storylines on each show last night that makes you the most enthusiastic for the product? Now on AEW, I think it has to be the debut of Chris Jericho's stable or faction, whatever they're going to be, whatever they are now. Chris Jericho's group was the most significant storyline on AEW Dynamite. And it does play into something that I think fans have commented on about AEW, about them not having a lot of established heels. You've got Jericho, MJF, Guevara, maybe the Dark Order, and then there's a lot of tweeners and a lot of baby faces. What happened last night on AEW Dynamite changed all that. We've now got Chris Jericho leading a faction with Jake Hager, Sammy Guevara, and Santana and Ortiz. And it's significant that this is a 5-person heel faction Because who are the baby faces that started AEW? It's the 5-person faction, sorry about this, Marty Skrull, of Cody, Hangman Page, Kenny Omega, and the Young Bucks. So you've got 5 top baby faces and 5 top heels in All Elite Wrestling. That's a fairly significant storyline development, which likely makes a lot of fans want to tune in next week to see what happens. On NXT, however, there were 2 very important storyline developments. And those were Finn Balor returning to NXT, doing so immediately after Matt Riddle versus Adam Cole. And then Tommaso Ciampa returning to NXT early from injury. And he's come back and has now gone face-to-face with NXT champion Adam Cole. So the 2 returning NXT champions versus Chris Jericho's new stable in AEW. Which makes you the most enthusiastic for the company moving forward? Chris Jericho with his new heel group, or Finn Balor and Tommaso Ciampa being back in NXT? So again, it sort of depends on what level of fandom you have for Jericho and his new stablemates, and what level of fandom you have for Balor and Ciampa. For me personally, the return of Finn Balor to NXT and the return of Tommaso Ciampa, those are more significant storyline developments for me, the kind of fan I am, and you know, I'm big fans of Finn Balor and Tommaso Ciampa. I am of Jericho as well. But those 2 guys, I think, are going to do big things in NXT moving forward. Perhaps more so than Jericho's stable faction does. So I'm giving the victory in storyline development for week 1 of the Wednesday Night Wars to NXT. Jericho's stable forming is a big deal, but Finn Balor returning to NXT and Tommaso Ciampa being back in the hunt for Goldie as well, to me, is a little bit more, has a little bit more for me to sink my teeth into, I think. So the next category we can begin to compare AEW Dynamite and NXT on is in terms of what they've got planned for next week. What have they advertised to their fans as reason for why they should watch their show next week and not the other company's show next week, although I guess most people are watching both shows somehow. So for NXT, there's 2 matches scheduled next week. Walter and Kushida will go one-on-one. Now, they have not mentioned if the UK title is on the line in this match. It doesn't appear to be. But Kushida and Walter, their angle that they've been building in the last 3 weeks, will come to a head next week as they face each other in singles competition. Also announced for next week is a Cruiserweight Championship match between Drew Gulak and Lio Rush. Lio Rush had won a number 1 contenders match previously to earn this title shot. Sort of interesting. Beth Phoenix and the NXT graphic for this match both referred to the Cruiserweight Championship as the NXT Cruiserweight Championship. And as we know, the Cruiserweight division will live more under the NXT brand moving forward. So has the Cruiserweight title been officially renamed? It does appear as though that might be the case. So we've got a Cruiserweight title match and Walter versus Kushida planned for next week on NXT. As for AEW Dynamite, there are 2 matches confirmed for next week. Shawn Spears will go one-on-one with Jon Moxley, and we will also get the start of the AEW Tag Team Championship Tournament first round as the Young Bucks take on Private Party. So, as for NXT, I mean, they do have 2 matches booked for next week. It's Walter and Kushida building up an angle, and then there's the Cruiserweight title match. However, with AEW Dynamite, the beginning of this tag team title tournament feels a little bit more significant than the two matches that NXT has planned. Also, Shawn Spears versus Jon Moxley. We know we're going to get the continuation of the Moxley versus Omega feud in that match. We're also going to be seeing Shawn Spears, and we're going to find out more about where he's going to land in AEW moving forward after his loss to Cody recently. And will Spears have Tully Blanchard in his corner for that match? So, even though there's some title matches booked for next week on NXT, I'm giving this category to All Elite Wrestling. I think that tag team title tournament kicking off next week is more reason to check out AEW Dynamite than the two matches NXT has scheduled. So that means we've got a tie between AEW and NXT, each winning out in two of the four categories. However, as this comes down to the tiebreaker, I'm going to say for the tiebreaker, feeling of importance is the most important category, and AEW won that category in week one of the Wednesday Night Wars. So I'm going to give week one of the Wednesday Night Wars to AEW via tiebreaker. But it will be very important to see who wins in the ratings war between AEW, Dynamite, and NXT on TNT. You'll want to stay tuned to SEScoops.com for that information as it comes out. Thanks very much for supporting this video. I'm Ian Carey for SEScoops.com.